And now we are moving on to our Q&A session. I'm getting a lot of questions, so we can't get to them all, but definitely I'm going to pick the most relevant ones to our discussion. And I will pass it around evenly to all of our participants. I want to start off from a question from Jamal from London, who's tuning in. This question is to Martine. And the question is, regarding disengagement efforts from Al-Shabaab, what metrics exist to suggest success of the disengagement efforts? Does Somalia have adequate communication strategies to both encourage future disengagement from Al-Shabaab or prevent from joining Al-Shabaab in the first place? So this sort of, I believe you've touched a little bit on this as well, so I'll let you answer that one.
Sorry, I was just finding the mute button. So I understand the question mostly to be kind of, what does success look like? Is that correct? And I think a part of the question answers the question itself, in the sense that if you have a successful disengagement process and people reintegrate into the community successfully, and if they are willing to speak up in communication products, like you have former members of Shabab who explains that they successfully defected, and if they are willing to talk about that, that will be a very powerful narrative. Of course, that is really difficult to get guys to speak up, because it is so dangerous for them, because the moment they leave, they have very high risk of Al-Shabaab seeking revenge against them. So it's difficult in communication efforts to have these kind of narratives of formers. And I think what is key in terms of what success look like, there's a little bit of discrepancy in the way that people think about this, because one group is talking about disengagement. The fact that you put down arms and you leave the group is a successful process. Others would argue that you have to de-radicalize, meaning that you have to change the views of the people who used to be there. So there's a little bit of, in terms of what a success metric look like, some would argue that you have to make sure that they don't engage in the violence physically. Whatever they think is up to them. Others would argue that you have to change their way of thinking, which is a far more challenging thing to do. So as I was trying to say, the success that we are working towards in the disengagement centers that exist is to promote a rehabilitation process where the individuals who leave Shabab, they obtain skills. You know, when they leave, they almost have no skill. The low-level defectors tend to have no skills at all. So giving them experiences that allow them to have an income, that you know, contributes for them to contribute to society meaningfully. The families tend to respect them because they can add value. So, you know, that is the approach that the centers are taking, that it's all about getting these guys to contribute positively to society in the future. And that's how, you know, both social and economic reintegration goes hand in hand in that sense. Yeah, the matrix for success is a difficult one, because it depends on how you see the problem in the first place. But right now it's kind of focused on that success is when guys are able to leave the centers and contribute in a meaningful way in the communities, financially and socially.
Thank you so much, Martine. And moving on to the next question. This question is for Ambassador Schwartz. And the question comes from Abdu, who's in Minneapolis, who wants to know, what could the US government and the international community do to strengthen the ties between the Somali federal member states and the federal government on issues of Al-Shabaab, elections, national reconciliation as well?
That's a very good question. And if I were the ambassador, and I'm not, it would be central to my thinking and that of my team in terms of, and dealing with other international partners, and is what approaches, because that would be the heart of diplomacy, to be honest with you, is trying to find ways to push that forward, because it's so central to progress on all fronts. I mean, I know that, you know, some statements have been made. I'm sure that many conversations have happened behind the scenes with limited success. Fortunately, President Formaggio has finally agreed to join the Dusamareb process, where he is now after really 2 years, I suppose, meeting with the member state presidents, you know, with an eye to trying to address certainly the electoral process. It's just a minimum requirement for leadership, to be honest. And I would just press on that. Also, there's really nothing to prohibit international partners from working directly with member states. The US used to have sort of a two-track policy. We wouldn't want to do things to reduce the legitimacy and capability of the federal government, but one can still work at various levels of society to do what one can. And in the process, try to foster partnership as well. But it's a very good question, and I'm sure a lot of people are working on that now.
I'll move on to the next question, and this is to Ambassador Schwartz. This question comes from Mike, who is in Washington, D.C. He says, in regards to international assistance, it seems that the regions with the most international support in terms of finance and military assistance remains the most insecure. For instance, with South and Central Somalia receiving the most aid, yet remaining the most insecure. Can we make the argument that the US and the international community efforts are not working in this region or in Somalia?
Yeah, I think a lot of Somalia is insecure. Although, sure, maybe in the extreme southern part, it's where Al-Shabaab is most entrenched, certainly in the Juba River Valley, and has been for years, controlling large population centers and a lot of territory. I mean, I think the bigger question is the military approach a sufficient tool? The answer is clearly no. And I think it was President Sheikh Sharif, I believe, who mentioned the Al-Shabaab taxation at the port and elsewhere. I mean, I visited Mogadishu in January, and I was struck. The one thing that all of my Somali interlocutors mentioned to me was how pervasive Al-Shabaab was throughout Mogadishu in terms of tax collection, whether it was from parliamentarians or the port or business owners or civil servants or just about anybody or any transaction. And you know, you hear that, you heard that from the president, and what can a military do against taxation? You know, that when it's so institutionalized and pervasive, clearly the approach, as the president suggested, needs to be comprehensive, needs to be far beyond just using the military. I think military certainly can have a role in all of this, but unfortunately it's been relied on as the principal tool, and that can't work. No matter how effective the SNA is, or the international backers, or even the regional forces, this won't have a military solution, whether it's in the southern part or the central part or Puntland. It needs to be much more pervasive, and it's going to rely much more on institutions of government being competent and addressing it, and addressing it in a variety of ways, not just military.
Thank you so much. Moving on to the next question. And this question comes from Ismail Warsame, who is in Portland, Oregon. And this question is to Martine. Ismail asks that many Somalis are concerned about Al-Shabaab's financial infrastructure. What can be done to electronically disrupt their communications and restrict the flow of resources?
Thank you. That's a really good question. I think there's a number of things that can be done, and I think there's a number of ways that Al-Shabaab are getting their finances. And I think it's fair to say that the primary source of income is local taxation. And when they, they manage checkpoints, they extort money from people. Whenever there's a transaction in a market, they would request a fee. So there will always be a limited number of finance that is really hard to do too much about by using electronic means. So, this idea that if we could just stop electronic money transfer, something like that, then we could stop the source of finance and that most of it is coming outside. I don't think that's the case. They do have a big source of funding by the way that they are doing taxation locally. So of course, on top of that, regional transfers, taking advantage of different infrastructures. There's ways that we can deal with that, but with the collaboration and the attempts to, work on counterterrorism financing, it's, lots and lots of people are working on this, and it's really quite difficult. Like, with, for example, M-Pesa in Kenya and similar money transfers, there's a relative large degree of accountability, and you can trace better than you could in the past. So I suppose what I just want to say on that question is, you're right that it's important and we have to keep improving our ways of controlling the finance, but we cannot be blind to the fact that there will always be local financing that, technical solutions cannot do very much about. So it's really first when we are able to engage in those environments and break their ability to tax locally, that's when we can really cut the source of financing. Because the international money transfers is only one source of finance, unfortunately.
And now moving on to another question, and this question goes to Ambassador Schwartz, and the question comes from Mohamed, who is in Columbus, Ohio. And the question is there a balance, or should there be a balance, between the US and international funding supporting military engagement versus diplomatic and development assistance?
Another excellent question. Yes, there should be a much better balance between military spending on the one hand and diplomatic or development spending on the other hand. I would want to see far more resources going into development and diplomacy. I think certainly on the US side, I think what we're spending on military support to Somalia, I think it's fine. It's a fraction of 1% of what we did in Afghanistan or Iraq. And I don't think we need to be applying much more. We may want to tweak it and do a little more training of Somali forces than just supporting, but I think the level, I don't have a problem with it. The problem that I have is I think we need far more resources going into helping build sort of human resources, training, education, and then also institutional development, so that Somalis can really start to put together the institutions to deliver services, security, justice for the Somali people.
Thank you very much. And this question also goes to Martine. And this question comes from Hassan from Nairobi. Nope, we've already asked that. Okay, so a question for you is, on your research on violent extremism in East Africa, what do you think the role of civil society can be in combating terrorism?
Great, thank you so much. The role in civil society is really crucial. in so many different aspects. If I can divide it into 3 components, I think civil society, and here I don't mean only, how can I say, civil society in a traditional sense, you know, youth programs, health programs, or like organizations that work on such issues, but also as what we talked about earlier, faith-based organization, thinking of those as a part of civil society. There's a lot that they can do in terms of encouraging individuals not to join these organizations, and also addressing some of the socioeconomic drivers and perhaps some of the marginalization issues, and contribute, you know, work with young individuals who want to change the world that they live in, but encourage them to do it in non-violent ways, and kind of channel all of that energy that is so important for change in society, but towards a less disruptive way of engaging in society. So I think civil society has a really big role to play in prevention, but I certainly also think that civil society has a key role to play, for example, as I was mentioning before, in the rehabilitation process. They can provide services, for example, in the disengagement centers, and they can support in terms of delivering civic education programs. They can deliver rehabilitation efforts of different kind, and they can support in terms of livelihood trainings and skills like that. So they also have a role to play within the rehabilitation process. Of course, that particular element is more sensitive and has to be controlled by government, just that the way it is now. Civil society should not lead it with outside a process that is not governed by policies managed by government, because it's so sensitive to work with such individuals, and indeed so dangerous. And then again, I think in the reintegration side, in terms of supporting individuals to reintegrate in society, civil society organizations that are strong could, you know, you could imagine a religious leader could provide mentorship, or other civil society organizations could bring youth together and create dialogue. So I would say that civil society organizations are key in this. The most sensitive parts of the process has to be led by government, and have governing policies and standards that is controlled by government, but otherwise prevention and reintegration, civil society are essential in making this work. So yeah, they have a very crucial role, I would say.
For Ambassador Schwartz and Mr. Ambassador, this question comes from Hassan, who is in Nashville, Tennessee. And his question is that the US government support in Somalia was to establish democracy. It turns out that the current administration is disrupting that process, not only for its international partners, but for the Somali people. Are we beginning to see the US investment in establishing a real democracy becoming a waste, given the current and the various actions that this current administration is engaged in?
I think that would be a premature conclusion. Somalia, despite all of its challenges, has, I'd say, restored actually its democratic character. Back in the 60s, it was known across Africa for its democracy. But as President Sheikh Sharif well knows, over the last 10 years, there have been 2, 3, 4 peaceful transfers of power of the senior executive. President Sheikh Sharif lost an election and stepped down. His successor, Hassan Sheikh, took over. 4 years later, lost an election, stepped down. One of the most profound and positive images that I retained from my time as ambassador was at President Formaggio's inauguration in February 2017, when he was at the podium making his address, and standing behind him were the 2 previous presidents. I mean, that was a picture. I leaned to the person next to me and said, that's a photo you can't find in many, many countries around the world. 3 presidents in a row standing together in harmony. You know, I think, you know, even under Hassan Sheikh, you know, there were challenges in developing an electoral model, and his administration did extend in office for some months as they sorted it out and put together the capability to pull off the electoral process. I think that can still happen now under the President Formaggio. I think it remains unknown what kind of extension they will seek, how quickly they can agree on a model, how quickly they can pull off the elections. I mean, clearly, I think if the Somali public, you know, sees that this is going on for whatever, a year or more, and that there's no real effort to reach a compromise and get things done, they could draw negative conclusions. But I don't think we're anywhere near there yet, and hopefully that can be avoided. I think what I saw is that the Somali people, its politicians, its leadership, they certainly want to retain the progress they've made so far, and they'll want to continue. I think there'll be quite a bit of pressure on the leaders now to reach some agreement and get on with holding the elections and moving forward. So I think it's premature to say that its democratic aims are lost, and one certainly hopes that won't happen.
Absolutely. And Mr. Ambassador, this is the last follow-up question for you. And this comes from Abdel Fattah Ahmed, who is in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And his question is, as Somali American professionals living here in the US, should the US State Department create initiatives or programs to support Somali American youth to go back and make a positive difference in their country?
I don't know that it's something the State Department needs to get involved in. I know I traveled to a number of Somali American communities in Minneapolis, Columbus, Seattle, and elsewhere, you know, and met with people. I know my successor, Don Yamamoto, has done so, officials from the State Department to remain in touch, to get input from Somali Americans on what we're doing and on policies and issues. But I think that thousands and thousands of Somali Americans have decided on their own to go back, whether it's to visit or to set up a business or work in government. And that's happening without the US government getting involved. And I would hope that would continue. I don't see the US government adding value to that process.
Thank you very much. And there you go, everyone. That is the conclusion of our program. I want to thank all the participants for joining us for our discussion today. Major shout outs and thanks to Ambassador Schwartz, Martine, and President Sharif for joining us as well, and for your comments and answering the public's questions about these issues of security and in Somalia. Please make some time to frequently visit our website for various other programs that we will be outlining, talking about security issues around the world. We thank you so much, and thank you for joining us. And everyone, please stay safe, and we wish you all the best. And thank you to our panelists.
Thank you, Mohamed. Mr. President, Martine, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Ahmed, Mr. Martine, and Mohamed. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.